Hi everyone, and welcome to Deep Geek Live. This is going to be a solo live stream, so it's just me for the next hour and a half or so, but we've got a really interesting subject for you today. It is Harrenhal, which is, I think, one of the most interesting, intriguing places in the entire world of Ice and Fire. So we're going to be doing this as we normally do. I've got some questions I've already got from my patrons that we're going to be working our way through, but I wanted to leave this as open as possible. So feel free to send questions through. I want to talk about the history of Harrenhal, how it was founded. I've had a couple of questions about that from my patrons. If you want to talk about the tourney at Harrenhal, then we can talk about that as well. So just let me know what you want to do, but I'm going to work through in rough chronological order. So we're going to start off with the founding of Harrenhal. But before I do that, just a couple of things I wanted to say. And first up, I just wanted to say thank you to my moderators who I see are out there. There's Chrissy Voldstones I can see there. J.R. Rowley is there. I'm sure Sonia Rangel is there as well. Guys, you do a great job, and I just wanted to publicly thank you. So if in the chat you want to give them a bit of love, that would be fantastic. Secondly, as I said, I've got some questions for my patrons I'm going to work through. If there's any super chats, obviously we'll come to them straight away. And I did just want to say thank you to Christy Miller for the super chat before we even started. Thank you, that's very kind. Just saying, I love your videos, keep up the good work. And I think I saw one from Brennan Barnes. Thank you, Brennan, that's very kind, saying, please say hi to Higa Herga. This, I assume, is because Brennan knows I love saying Higa Herga, because Higa Herga is a lovely thing to say. But I also just wanted to actually say thank you also to Higa Herga, who became a patron this week. So thank you very much. I say it every week. I cannot do this without the support of my patrons. So thank you so much. That's really appreciated. But let's get into this. And we're going to start by talking about Harrenhal and its foundation. So I'm going to take Pegleg Pete over on Patreon said, please remind us of why the location of Harrenhal was chosen and why he built it. Was there a vision or a dream or some other reason? Well, so the he here is Harren the Black. Now, the sort of the background to all of this is that the Iron Islanders at that time, they're quite powerful, and they'd extended their empire out beyond just the Iron Islands, out into what we now think of as the Riverlands. And so we had House Hoare, which was where Harren the Black came from. They styled themselves as the kings of the isles and the rivers. And as time went on over 2 or 3 generations, they more and more started to base themselves actually in the Riverlands rather than in on the Iron Islands. And so Harren the Black's father had built himself a castle slightly upriver on, I think it was the Blue Fork. And then Harren the Black, who thought to himself, you know what, I need a capital. I need somewhere that I can base myself, and somewhere that is bigger and better and more impressive than anything else in the world. So he, at base, was a man with a huge ego, and so he wanted to build the biggest, the mightiest, the most magnificent castle in the land. And he thought the best thing to do was to build it pretty much central in Westeros, in the sort of the known land, and that was in the lands that he had. There was no huge castle in the immediate vicinity, so that's what he did. He built it there. This wasn't a matter of a huge prophecy that says you must build a castle here or anything like that. This is pure humanity. This is a man who just wants to show that he is the best, the biggest and the best king in the land. Because at the time, there wasn't this one king over all of Westeros. There were lots of kings, smaller kings, when we had the 7 kingdoms, and there were all these different kingdoms were sort of like constantly battling each other across the land, and he was trying to show that he was the best. So that's what the idea was. It wasn't an idea based on any kind of prophecy. It was purely that he wanted to build the biggest and most impressive castle that he could. Now, in building that, just to move on to Mary Montgomery's question. Hi, Mary. Good to see you. I saw you in the chat there earlier. She was asking that Harren chopped down the weirwood trees to use in the construction of Harrenhal. Why do you think that the heart tree survived? After all, the Ironborn didn't worship them, so he left one weirwood tree. Any notion why? Now, this, I think, fits in with this idea that we have that this is a purely human-driven endeavor. This isn't some great vision from above or prophecy or anything like that. This is just one man wanting to build the biggest and the best castle that there is. And when you look around the castles of Westeros, you see what they almost all have, and that's a godswood, and it's a heart tree. And the Andals, when they'd invaded, they broadly kept that, or in some cases actually introduced that, sop to the locals as a try and way to sort of keep the locals, the followers of the old religion, the old gods, keep them on side. So that's why all the different castles in Westeros have these godswoods, even if they don't actually follow the old gods. And so if Harren the Black was wanting to build a Westerosi castle, he had to have a godswood. So that is why he kept the one weirwood tree. Now, the thing that makes me reasonably clear that that's what it was about was that the godswood is described as being a bit over 20 acres in size. Now, that is a huge godswood. Everything in Harrenhal is at a level not just one notch above everything else, but like many notches above everything else. When you think about Winterfell, that has got a magnificent godswood, obviously a huge weirwood tree, that is 3 acres, I think. So what he did was he said, okay, so what's Winterfell got? 3 acres. I'll make something 7 times the size. So that is the idea behind it. It's not that he was wanting to worship the old gods. There was not anything much of that there. He also built a sept for worship of the Seven, because, you know, that's what you did. That's what castles had. He had everything, but just supersized. So regardless of whether he personally wanted it, he put those things in place. So that was why that weirwood tree there is there. And it's a really interesting weirwood tree. It's got this incredibly pained, angry face on it, which is even more than any of the other trees that we hear mention of. And that is perhaps a relic, and we'll come on to this in a moment, a relic of how the other weirwoods were used during the construction of Harrenhal. But we did just get a couple of quick super chats that I want to come on to. Ado Monica Jedlik, or Ledlik, I can't pronounce it. Hello, apologies for mangling your name, but thank you so much for the super chat. That's very kind. And Higa Herga, thank you. $20, that's very kind. Saying, with all the blood involved with the construction, if the story is true, wouldn't that make Harrenhal a huge battery powered by a primitive blood magic ritual with the cut White Walkers supplying the memories that weirwoods supplying the memories that play back in residual haunting? Okay, so this brings us on to the and I'll answer this in parts if that's okay, Higa Herga, because I think that this is the first bit is about the actual construction. So what we have here is something that was built not just with stone, it was also built using weirwood. As we were talking about a moment ago, there were actually quite a few weirwoods around there where Harrenhal now is, and all but one of them were chopped down. Incidentally, there's if you actually look at the map, around that part of Westeros is quite a hub of where weirwoods used to be, because as well as that, there obviously the Isle of Faces is only just south of it as well, and there's a couple of others. So you get Raventree Hall is just a little bit further up, and High Heart, where there were 31, I think, of these weirwood trees all there. So there was, before they got chopped down. So there was quite a hub of weirwood trees around that area. But anyway, so they were chopped down and used in the construction of Harrenhal, and it said that blood was also mixed up. Human blood was mixed up with the construction of it, sort of, so with the concrete that they used effectively to bind the stones together. So what we've got there is a lot of the ingredients of a lot of the kind of magic that we know about, because we get if you're thinking about magic, always has to involve sacrifice in the world of Ice and Fire in one way, shape, or form. Blood is clearly very important when you're talking about the old gods, and obviously you get the weirwoods having been cut down there as well. They've been involved in this process. And then later on, as we'll come to in a bit, obviously there was fire, which came in with dragon fire. So we do have all of these ingredients there of magic, of some sort of spell. However, what I do not think we have is an intention on the part of Harren the Black to create that, if that makes sense. So when in your question you're talking about a primitive blood magic ritual, with the cut weirwoods supplying the memories that play back in a residual haunting, this is playing into the idea that Harrenhal is both haunted and cursed in a way. Now, again, we'll come on to this in a moment, but every family who's had control of Harrenhal, pretty much, they've died out. It has been a curse for people going through time, and just in the 300 years or so since it was built, because Harrenhal, should probably have said earlier, is not an ancient castle in the way that we get Storm's End or Winterfell or any of these other castles are ancient castles, millennia old. This is only 300 years old, but in that 300 years, it's had huge amounts of not just things going on, but terrible things to whoever owned it at the time. And we see that incidentally going on through A Song of Ice and Fire, through the books, when we see people like Janos Slynt, who was given it. We see that Tywin had control of it for a while. Then we see Littlefinger gets given it, and we know what happened to him on the show. So there is this idea of this curse. But to return to that central question, I do not think there was an intentional bit of magic that was going on by Harren the Black. However, the weirwoods, the memories of the weirwoods were indeed imbued within the bones, as it were, within the stone of Harrenhal, and with the sacrifice and with the fire as well, then yes, that may well indeed have had some magical impact. And you could certainly imagine that the weirwoods, the weirwood network, would not have wanted this to happen. So they could very well have let out their anger over time following. So it's not so much a deliberate curse by somebody as this is just what has followed, given the actions that were happening there. I hope that kind of makes sense. So I'm not a believer that there was a curse, but I do believe that there was probably some sort of magic trigger that was going on with that. Mazamonti, hi, good to see you. So £5, thank you for that. That's very kind. What is George R.R. Martin trying to tell us with the 13 cuts that bleed every spring? So this is a reference to the weirwood that we were talking about, the weirwood that is still standing, the heart tree and the godswood. Now, there was a fight as part of the Dance of the Dragons. There was a fight between Daemon Targaryen and someone someone else who somebody in the chat will, I'm sure, remember. But as part of that, it took place just outside the weirwood. It got cut, and when it got cut, then the sap from the weirwood came out. So it's like it bleeds. And so every spring it kind of bleeds again. So the question is, what does that signify? And this is the kinds of times when I wish I had LML on here, because I suspect that he would probably have some huge symbolism about number 13 and all the rest of it. I personally take this as just a reminder of the fact that the weirwood is at the heart of this, and that has remained there when this castle has been built up around it and then got burnt back down again. So the weirwood is effectively crying. It is angry, it is weeping, it is bleeding. So this is, if anything, this is a remembrance of what has happened to the weirwoods, and so it is a sort of a figurative remembrance. That is what I would say. I don't think, perhaps somebody in the chat has got another idea. Please do let us know if you do. I don't think that there's a specific thing here with 13 cuts meaning a specific clue to anything in particular. But really good question. Thank you for that. Coming back briefly to the construction of this, Susan Dunkel asked, is there any mention of an attempt to use the Isle of Faces as a place to harvest wood or resources in the building of Harrenhal? It seems strange that a personality as bombastic as Harren the Black wouldn't have tried to conquer the God's Eye Lake as well as the Isle of Faces, even against great odds. There appears to have been no attempt at all, at least no record that I can find. So I think I would agree that he definitely would have thought that he could use those materials. I think he definitely thought that that was part of his empire. The fact that it wasn't, as far as we know, we don't have a record of this, as far as we know, that he didn't go there and chop down those trees, I think just tells us that the Isle of Faces operated then as we've known it to generally always operate, which is if somebody tries to come close to it, then something happens. Loads of birds swoop in to attack, or the wind blows your boat away, or whatever. The magic around that place is hugely powerful, and I think that Harren the Black, yes, he was, as you say, bombastic. He had a huge ego, but at the same time, I don't think he needed to prove anything to himself by taking the Isle of Faces. And I think that if it turned out that actually that was really quite hard, then why would he bother? So I think that his focus was on building the castle rather than conquering an island that frankly nobody really used or wanted, is probably because it's, although it's central to Westeros, actually you'll find it's not mentioned all that much in the books. It is a little bit in book 1, but after that it kind of like people don't even think about it that much. It's almost as if it's got this kind of force field around it that's preventing people going to it and actually engaging with it, even in terms of the knowing it's there. So no, I don't think I think he might have tried it, but I don't think that it was successful. And another, thank you, £5 again, another super chat from Mazamonti. Cherie, is this it looks like this is picking up a question from somebody else, and if so, thank you. I do love it when people do that, if they see a question that somebody else has asked that perhaps I haven't spotted, because the chat goes through quite quickly, particularly when I'm just doing this by myself. It's quite easy to miss things, so having them flagged up in super chats means that I do spot them. So thank you for that. Robert, do you think Harrenhal could turn out to be a sanctuary for men against the Night King and his army? Yes, Cherie's question, a good one. Yes, I think sanctuary is probably the wrong way of putting it, though. So we've got on the show, I personally believe that they are not going to give us the Isle of Faces. They've not really mentioned it at all. That's not what anyone seems to be thinking about. By now, I would have thought that they would have at least dropped in a few clues that this was something important, but they haven't. So I personally don't think that the show will be going to the Isle of Faces. Now, and sorry, you're talking about Harrenhal, where I'm sort of conflating the two here, I have to say. In terms of the show, I think that they might show a little bit of stuff there, but it's really going to be about the Night King just moving to the places that we have seen a lot of in the show, the Winterfells, the King's Landings, and things like that. Harrenhal on the show was a sort of a well, it wasn't the most important place that they went to. There were a few episodes there, but that was pretty much it. It was largely just used as a base for the action with Arya and Jaqen and so on. Now, could it strategically be a sanctuary for people against the Night King? Well, yes, it could, because it is exactly the kind of place that you can hide. It may well been burned. The tops of it burned and melted stone. In fact, that was how hot the dragon fire was. But it's still a really sturdy base. It's a really sturdy castle. So it could indeed be a place for people to hide out. I don't, however, think that they will go there that much in the books. They might acknowledge it as they go past, but I really think that it's going to be focusing in on the things that they've built up an emotional attachment to, which are things like Winterfell. If Winterfell gets attacked, if Winterfell gets harmed in any way, then that will impact on us as viewers, because we have seen it all the way through the series. Same with King's Landing. Harrenhal, it's already pretty burned and bleak, so it wouldn't actually make much of an impact on us as viewers if it did get attacked. So I think it's a really good idea strategically on the show. I think it's quite different in the books, incidentally, but on the show I think it's quite a good idea strategically, but I'm not sure that they will go down that route. Mr. Chris Cable, £4.99. Thank you very much. Just saying, great content. Your voice and tone is so relaxing. Thank you. That's very kind. And just as I spotted another one just below that, Loss and the Panda saying, hey, this is my first time catching you live. Love your videos. Thank you so much, and welcome. I love it when people come on for the first time live. It's a different way of doing these things. It's a lot more interactive, and I really enjoy it. I love making the videos as well, but being able to just sort of react to questions as well is really invigorating, I have to say. It's great stuff. Okay, guys, so that's, I think, what I was going to say about the building of Harrenhal. It's the main thing that we have to say here is that this is a matter of one man's ego and one man wishing to show that he was bigger and better and stronger and more powerful than anybody else in the entirety of Westeros. So that what we've got, JL Rowley says, check Messenger, new super chat from Carlo. Thank you very much. If you could, JL Rowley, if you could possibly cut and paste that into the chat here, I will keep an eye out for it. That'll just be a lot easier for me when I'm just doing this solo. Thank you. But the reason why I keep on emphasizing the fact that this is one man's ego is because this is a story of hubris. This is a story of pride before a fall. This is a story of how humanity might think that it is invulnerable, but it is not compared to things like dragons. Because, of course, what happened was that the very day that it was finished, at the moment that Harrenhal was finished, that was when the Targaryens invaded. And when we talk about the Targaryens invading, really, this is the three of them, the three siblings and their dragons, and just a handful of retainers to start with. They built their army after landing. They built their army by conquering people. That was the way it worked. So it wasn't so much an invasion as just them coming in and saying, okay, so we've got dragons, you now have to accept us as your rulers. That was the way it worked. And obviously some of the kings saw the dragons, went, okay, fair enough, that's it, we know when we're beat. And some of them didn't. And one of the ones that didn't was Harren the Black. And Harren the Black, as well as having this huge ego, he now thought that he was in a castle that could not be assaulted, could not be defeated. So he was very much there just defying them. We get Aegon arrived there outside Harrenhal, and they had this little summit, and Harren says, okay, then you know what, I'm not going to bend the knee. Goes into his castle, stays into his castle. Then obviously Balerion the Black Dread comes and melts the top of Harrenhal and leaves it this black desolation. So that this is a story which incidentally is handed down from generation to generation. It's the kind of thing that when you get these tales from the Age of Heroes, the kind of stories that Old Nan tells get passed down, and they're stories which, yes, they're retaining memories from a long time ago, but they're also stories that give a message, give a moral, in the same way that fairy tales might in our culture. And the tale of Harren the Black and Harrenhal is used in that same way. It's even told by Old Nan, incidentally. This isn't a story for her from millennia ago. It's a story from just 300 years ago, but it's still the same. The story of a man who got so proud that he just lost everything. Let's just have a quick look. The Disputed Lands is here. Hi, great to see you. We had Amanda on, was it just last week? I think it was, and she's excellent. If you do want some excellent A Song of Ice and Fire content, I highly recommend that you check out Crowfoot's Daughter, The Disputed Lands. I will just have a very quick check. Apologies if you're watching this on catch up. I'm just going to have a quick check to see whether I can see this other comment. I can't right now, so let's just charge on as we are. Okay, so once we've got that, and let's move on to start talking about the curse. Now, Anime Lover says, do you think we will see Harrenhal in a flashback on the TV show? And do you think the old gods cursed the place? So first up, in terms of do I think we will see it in a flashback, I suspect not. For the reasons I gave a moment ago, I tend to the opinion that Harrenhal is not going to be, and the Isle of Faces, they're not going to be the center of attention on the show. They've only got 6 episodes. They're going to be focusing in on the main areas that they have been previously focusing in on. In terms of a flashback, the 2 flashbacks that we might potentially have got is the bit about Harren the Black that we've already seen. I can't see that would add to the plot of the show at this stage. I think that's really good background, but I don't think that they would add it in terms of a flashback. The second thing might be the tourney at Harrenhal. In terms of the show, I can't see that would be used as a as a flashback now, because the purpose of the tourney of Harrenhal was to show where Jon came from, what the start of Robert's Rebellion was, and all the things like that. If they have flashbacks in the show, I think it's now going to be a lot more focused back on why the White Walkers are invading, and therefore what clues that gives us about how they might be turned back, because certainly in the books, and I hope in the show, it's not just a matter of living versus dead, good versus bad. It's going to be a lot more nuanced than that, and there is a reason for the White Walkers heading south, and it's not just because they're bad guys, as George R.R. Martin often says. And I shall paraphrase, but nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, you know what, I'm going to be bad now. Everyone is a hero in their own story. Everyone thinks that they're justified in what they're doing, and that goes for the others, the White Walkers, just as it does for every human in the story as well. Brennan Barnes, thank you very much for the super chat. Any thoughts on who sits as Harrenhal ruler at the end? Yeah, well, I have some. I think that it has to be given over not just to a person. I think it has to be some sort of either abandoned and left to the old gods in a way, or it has to be part of some sort of corporate thing, because I think we've seen that no one family can ever rule it. It is about hubris. It is about humanity overstretching itself. So I do not think that it would be an appropriate end for the show for it just to be handed to a person and told, well, now you can sort that out. The problem of Harrenhal on a very practical level, leaving aside any idea of curse, is that it was so big that no family was ever rich enough to actually have enough guards to guard the walls, to buy enough wood to heat all the halls, to fill all of the space that they've got there. It was just ridiculously large. They would have to just imagine the amount of gardeners that they would need to be keeping their godswood in trim. That kind of thing is just way too large. So I do not think that just handing it to a person or a family is going to answer it. I think that this is going to be tied up with what actually is the final way forward after the Iron Throne, the rule of the Iron Throne is over, because I do believe that the Iron Throne will not continue in its current way as just having an individual ruler. My boring answer to this, Brennan, I think, is that we won't actually find out. I think that certainly on the show, they're not going to get into all the details of everything that's going on, who gets given what and when and why and how. They will tell us what happens to each individual character, I'm sure. So, for example, they will, if Bronn survives, as I suspect he will on the show, they will show him being given his reward, because that's the end of his character arc. Incidentally, I think that's going to be the twins for Bronn, just a hunch, because there was that joke with Jaime about having two castles, the twins, two castles. So that kind of makes sense. But I don't think that they're going to go through every single castle and province and say who's now in charge of what afterwards. I think they'll leave that. In the books, it might be slightly different, so I don't know. But certainly on the show, I can't see that they will tell us, actually, I'm afraid. Jason Weeks, thanks for coming and saying that we can start. Feel free to skip back to the beginning if you missed anything. Just have a quick flick through some of the questions in the chat, if I can see anything immediately there. So Titania Blue says, I highly doubt we'll get a flashback of the tourney of Harrenhal in the show, but oh man, wouldn't that be amazing? Yes, it would. But the thing with the tourney at Harrenhal is that there was so much that happened there. You have to try and pick out what is it that you would possibly show. in George R. R. Martin has said that so much happened at the turning at Harrenhal, you could write a whole book about what happened, and a George R. R. Martin book at that. So there was so much that got packed into those few days that if you were going to do a flashback, you'd have to decide what it is you were doing. Are you wanting to show what happened with Jaime, or what happened with the Mad King, or what happened with the Knight of the Laughing Tree? What was going on with Ashara Dane? What about Howland Reed? Where does he fit into all of this? There are so many different angles you could come at it from. I don't think that the show will pick up on any of them in a flashback, but certainly hope that in the books we'll get a whole lot more about it. B. Warwick asks, would it be easier or possible to maintain Harrenhal if you tore down the largest tower and used its material to repair the rest of the fortress, and it would leave one with less castle to maintain? Well, yes, that's certainly an option. There are 5 huge towers in Harrenhal, and yes, the tallest one is ridiculously high, but the others are also very high as well. The problem isn't so much just having a tower it's to maintain, it's the size and scale of the castle itself. The ceilings of just average things are like 2 or 3 times the height of normal ceilings. It's just everything was built on a giant scale. It wasn't just that there was, you know, a few big towers. Everything is huge. The stables were, and I forget the exact amount there, but they could hold, you know, I think it was something like 1,000 horses or something. It was just ridiculously large. Just maintaining it was what the problem was. Yes, you could try and cut down different bits, but I think the only way to make it actively manageable would be huge reconstruction and changing the whole scale of everything that's there. The buildings themselves would need to be torn down and rebuilt to normal scale. So I think it's a really good idea. I think it would probably help, but it's probably it's just a small part of what would need to be done. Just had a super chat from Lexi Luminescent. Fantastic name. $10. Thank you. That's very kind. Denelle Luston is based on Elizabeth Bathory. Some historians believe that stories about her were made up by other nobles. Do you think that the same could be true about Luston? And if so, who? Okay, so this is a question about House Lothston, which I found very hard to say, I have to say, who were one of the houses, there were 5 or 6 of them, who had ownership of Harrenhal after Harren the Black. So they were something like the 4th of the house to have it. Now, each of the houses has some kind of a tragic story. One of them, the people got caught up, died in a fire. Another one, there was Maegor the Cruel, just wiped out the entire family because he didn't like, I think one of them was his mistress, and he thought that she was cheating on him, so he killed the entire family, as you do. And we know about House Whent and things like that. House Lothston seems to end with this character called Danelle Lothston, who was a figure who we just get stories about. And we just seem to get stories about because there seem to be a lot of stories about her. She's said to, just as off the top of my head, she wore figure-hugging black armor, which sounds incredibly impractical, and she used to drink blood and things like that, and basically she was seen as mad. So she descended into madness, and it was with her end that family lost Harrenhal. So the question, and I think it's a fantastic question, is whether the same could be true for, as was with Elizabeth Bathory, that stories were made up about her. Now, with all of these things, yes, you would expect if there are stories about somebody, then there's probably firstly a kernel of truth, or otherwise people don't believe them. That, incidentally, is how Littlefinger gets away with so many of his lies, is that there's often a kernel of truth in there somewhere. That so with the dagger, the cat's paw dagger, he can get away with talking about pretending that that it was his, but it went to Tyrion, because the kernel of truth there was that it was his, and then he did lose it in a bet, and so that rings true, and also because Cat was looking for an excuse. She thought it must be the Lannisters. So a lot of these things rely on a kernel of truth, but that doesn't mean that they are completely true. I can believe very much that there would be other nobles who might wish to spread rumors. The question always has to come up: who gains from this? And I think that is a part of history of Westeros that we have not enough information to know exactly who would gain from it. Is it another noble family who were trying to get rid of them so that they could gain control of Harrenhal? Perhaps, but we simply do not know. Personally, I suspect that, yes, those stories were either made up or exaggerated. I dare say that she may well not have been completely sane at the end. That there seems to be quite a lot of mental illness, it has to be said, in Song of Ice and Fire. There are a lot of characters who we just reading about and seeing without actually thinking, if they were in our world, what would we think is going on there? There's a lot of mental illness, so I think there probably was something going on there, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a kernel of truth in the stories. Whether they were spread by anyone in particular does depend on who thinks that they might have gained from it. Just have a quick flick through. But actually, I will take a quick pause at the moment before we move on more into sort of the history of it after its creation and destruction. Because, as always, I just want to let people know what's coming up on the channel. You probably know my series that I'm working my way through what happened at the tourney at Harrenhal, Robert's Rebellion, and the Tower of Joy. We've got another one of them coming up on Sunday. I was going to do it as the sort of the third part of a trilogy on the rebellion itself. I've got a video that I'm sort of halfway through there on what happened with the Lannisters. How did they suddenly end up being so powerful at the end of all this when they weren't actually involved in most of the war? And then Ned, also what happens to him afterwards with the sack of King's Landing, which is an incredibly important time that we don't actually think huge amounts about, and then leading up to the point when he goes towards the Tower of Joy. How did he know to go there? That's the question. So anyway, I've got a video on that, which is half done, but I got distracted this week, I must say, by the video that will be coming out this Sunday, which is going to be about Dany and the house with the red door and the lemon tree. If you've been in this kind of fandom for a while, then I'm sure you'll be aware of all of the theories and thought around this. But it comes from the fact that Dany, when she thinks about her past, she thinks that she was brought up for the first 5 years or so in Braavos, and she remembers a house with the red door with a lemon tree outside. And we're told repeatedly that trees do not grow in Braavos, and lemon trees in particular do not. So the question is, what's going on there? Is Dany misremembering? Is there some bigger secret going on here? Something that she's hiding? Something perhaps she doesn't know about her own identity? Quaithe keeps on telling her to remember who she is. Is this some kind of prompt to actually remember, oh, all I thought about my history is wrong? So those are the kinds of questions I'm going to be getting into there. I think I'm reasonably clear in my mind what Dany's past was and what the truth of that is, and that video is coming out on Sunday. So that's the first thing. Second thing, patrons. I've said it before. I can't do this without you. Thank you so much. It's incredibly generous in your support. It allows me to be doing this, to be dedicating the time that I do to making the videos. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And thirdly, as I've been saying for a few weeks now, please do check out my second channel. If you like listening to audiobooks, particularly classic science fiction, fantasy stories, then please do check out The Well-Told Tale. That's my it's just me once a week on a Wednesday reading the way through the classics of the genre. We've done The War of the Worlds. We're currently partway through Frankenstein. After that, we've got another number of absolute classics that we're going to be working our way through. So if you'd like that, please do check that out. There's a link down in the description to that. There's also a link in the description if you would like to become a patron, just if you want to support the channel, or if you want to get access to some patron only benefits. Please do check that out. But let's get back to some of these questions. Brennan Barnes was asking over on Patreon what happened to Lady Whent. Now, so Lady Whent was the hang on. So the Whents were the family who held the castle at the time of Robert's Rebellion, and they held it all the way through to the start of A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, we'll perhaps talk about the turning at Harrenhal in a bit, but when we get to the start of A Song of Ice and Fire, it appears that Lady Whent, who was probably the widow of Lord Whent, who hosted the tourney at Harrenhal, she was the ruling lady of Harrenhal at the time. So it doesn't appear that she's got much by way of heirs at this time, and she is just ruling this huge castle that she can't possibly maintain. Now, then we get all of the Wars of the Five Kings and all the rest of it, and she has to effectively hand over the castle to the Lannister forces because she can't possibly defend it. They then Tywin, it gets handed over to Janos Slynt, and then after that it gets handed over to Littlefinger, and she just seems to kind of disappear. Now, there are various mentions of her. The last one we have is actually that she had died. And there's no reason given for this, no explanation of how or whatever. The person saying this, incidentally, is Littlefinger, so we shouldn't necessarily believe it to be true. He was the person who'd been given Harrenhal, so it was probably in his best interest to tell everyone that the previous owner was no longer there, so there was no disputed ownership. I think the short answer is we do not know where she is. As far as we can tell, she left Harrenhal. She probably from there, wars raging around her, would have then wanted to go somewhere safe. We don't know where that might be, but she was an old lady. So it's entirely reasonable to think that, yes, she probably did die. We might see her again again in the books, but I think that if she didn't die of old age, I think there's also a secondary chance that Littlefinger might well have got rid of her because she was a rival claimant to it. Bobby Catalano, thank you so much. $4.99. Can you start over? I was late. Joke. I would love to. So, but if after this you can go back, it will be appearing on the YouTube channel almost straight away afterwards. So if you want to go back and check the beginning, then please do. Let's go. I've got one more question from my patron to go through, but then, guys, I'm going to start coming to questions in the chat after that. And Piano Diva 11, do you think there is any way that Harrenhal can be redeemed? I've thought it could be a possible location for a new capital, assuming that King's Landing will be destroyed, being located smack in the centre of Westeros and near several rivers. Seems to be too big for one family to handle, but maybe there's some way it could function as a neutral central government location. Now, I just really like the idea of future Westerosi government being on the shores of the God's Eye. I really like this idea. I don't know whether it will come to pass. As much as I was sort of bigging up the idea that this is about humanity's pride and folly, there is also, if you kind of look at the flip side of that, where the story in A Song of Ice and Fire in the books is going to end is, I think, something along the lines of the ice that could destroy the world with the others is being pushed back in some way. The fire that could destroy the world, being the dragons and so on, is pushed back in some way. And that means that humanity can actually start trying to build things for itself without these twin threats, because there has to be a balance. One can't be driven away and the other remain. So, that being said, we're then left with this idea of if humanity is left in charge, perhaps then it is time to build the great castles again for humanity to actually advance technology. Because don't forget, they've been a long time with not much advancement in technology, and a lot of this is probably down to the Maesters, but generally speaking, it's not advanced hugely, even over in Essos. So perhaps this is the time for humanity to actually start dreaming big and building the huge things. The reason why Harrenhal didn't work the first time was not because it wasn't built very well. It was built very well. It was because there were dragons. There's this supernatural magical force that stopped it. So I am drawn to this idea that it could play some kind of central part going forward, but it would take a complete reworking, and that would take a huge amount of time and effort, and we certainly won't see that happen in the books, because the books won't give us that long-term look going forward. House Kraken Tacos, just saying hello. Hello back to you. Thank you so much. That's very kind. And Carrie Nevers saying Curse of Harrenhal, lead poisoning, perhaps. Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think that there's the Curse of Harrenhal as it was is a thing that says that anyone who owns this, they're gonna die. Their house will die out, and the house dies out in different ways for different peoples. Yes, there was madness over there, but there was also burning going on over here. There was also the rages of a mad and cruel king happening here. There was just the ravages of war which pushed the Whents out. There's a lot of different things. So I don't think it's just one factor that's going on here. I think that there is something much bigger moving on through it. So guys, let's quickly check through this. Jason Nursel, apologies, I probably mangled your name as well. A lot of YouTubers rely on the statement that lemon trees don't grow in Bravos to dispute Dany's recollection that she grew up there. Every single known religion seems to have a temple in Bravos. Does Bravos have no magic that would allow a lemon tree to go? Also, lemon trees grew apparently in Winterfell. Sansa and Arya like lemon cakes. So this is coming back to the video that I'm going to be making for, which is coming out on Sunday. I won't go into this in too much detail now because otherwise I'll be spoiling my video, although I do always seem to spoil my upcoming videos in these live streams. I would just say that yes, there is magic that is in Bravos. I don't think that's the answer to this this question. In terms of the lemon trees in Winterfell, we don't hear of any lemon trees themselves in Winterfell, although they could be imported. It was a reasonably well-worn trade route that goes up to White Harbour from, say, Dawn up to White Harbour, and then upstream up to Winterfell. So when Sansa and Arya had lemon cakes, these were special treats, and these were because they'd managed to get hold of some lemons, not that they've grown them. That said, Winterfell has got greenhouses. It's glass garden that they do grow huge amounts of things that you wouldn't expect them to be able to grow. We just haven't heard that they've got any lemon trees. Tam Hutchins is also talking about lemon trees. I have a lemon tree and I live in the land of always winter, aka Maine. Yes, I think that lemon trees can probably survive in a lot more temperate climes than perhaps we sometimes think, where they might not be able to thrive, but they could certainly survive. Added to which, hey, this is a magical world. That doesn't mean that you have to use magic in order to make a lemon tree grow. It just means that maybe the laws of how lemon trees and all kinds of trees grow might be different there than it is here. Robert Lagville says Harren the Black has a Napoleon complex. Yes, quite possibly. We don't know actually anything to do, I think, with his physical description, but it was about him being, this whole idea is about him just being incredibly full of himself. It's just this huge and actually frankly quite fragile male ego that he had was going on there. Lots of other chat about lemon trees. Did anyone have any questions about the tourney at Harrenhal? I'm very aware that we've been talking about Harrenhal now for an hour or so, and at some point soon I suspect my voice will want to give out, so that's why I'm sort of throwing out the question now. Did anyone have any questions about the tourney at Harrenhal and what happened there? It just seems like one thing that we haven't covered yet. If no one has, then I'm quite happy not to cover it at all. Lady Laura Dane says, where are the former lords of Harrenhal buried? Do they have a crypt? We don't hear that they have a crypt, but I would imagine that it's different according to all the different families that were there, how they were buried. I assume that they were buried. The different areas of Westeros had different traditions as to how people would be, or what would happen to bodies after they died. So, for example, the Targaryens burned the bodies of their dead. And in the north, then, yes, they had crypts, but also, and it's not just Winterfell, incidentally, that there are crypts. There's also a crypt at the Dreadfort, I think, and probably in a few other places. So it's not just Winterfell. There are others, but also they had barrows, so they would bury their dead in barrows. Obviously, we know about the Iron Men as well, who would do that with giving bodies back to the sea. There are lots of different ways of dealing with this, and so the different families may well have had different ways of dealing with their dead. Had a super chat from Julie Beth Stiles, $10. Thank you very much. This is from her and Tatiana Blue. Thank you so much for picking up somebody else's question as well. Do you think that Balerian's Dragonfire may have added a magic to Harrenhal that makes it safer against the others? Now, that's a very good question. I think what I was saying earlier was that I feel that there is some magic that has happened here, magic that perhaps has been wrought in some way by the Weirwood network, because all the constituent parts are there. I do not think that the fact that the stones were melted by the Dragonfire itself in and of itself provides some protection against the others. What I do think might, in some way, is the fact that this was built, as I say, This is the way I view it is that this is still owned by the Weirwoods. This is right by the heart of the Weirwood network and the Isle of Faces. The land itself had a Weirwood grove on it, and Weirwoods are within the construct itself, and there is a Weirwood tree still there. So almost certainly there are Weirwood roots all the way underneath the castle. So if you're thinking about the massive castle up above, underneath that, underground, there is probably an equally huge complex of Weirwood caves and networks running to and fro and down to the Isle of Faces and across to lots of other different places with Weirwoods. And so I think that is what might provide protection. I think the magic potentially was sparked, pun intended, by the fire that came in there, but it was also bought and built by the sacrifice, by the blood of, and I didn't really mention it before, but when we're talking about there being blood there in the stones, the stories that we're told of how Harren the Black built this, because it is so huge, was that he basically took on slave labor, and hundreds, thousands of people died in the construction of this, and so they were effectively being sacrificed to the creation of this castle. So there is so much going on in that's a sort of an added and magical layer. I think that Balerian's fire added to it, rather than that in and of itself being the thing that might provide a layer of protection. Kid28, $10, thank you so much. While I love all your content, I can't help but feel slightly disappointed that the Harrenhal, Robert's Rebellion, and Terror of Joy series will be delayed. Anyhow, keep up the great work. Well, I don't actually think that this is delaying it. I'm sorry if that's how it came across. I don't actually. I see this as a part of the same series, actually, because this is about Dany's past and whether or not she truly is who she thinks she is, because that stems from the fact that she was conceived right during that time, during the rebellion, just before the army, well, just when news is coming effectively of Rhaegar's death, and she is being conceived, and then she goes off to Dragonstone. Well, she doesn't go off to Dragonstone. Her mother, Queen Rhaella, goes off to Dragonstone. So I see this as all part of the same story. I'll also, as part of this, at some point in this story, in this series of videos, I'm also going to be looking at Fagon, or Aegon. Young Griff book readers will know exactly what I'm talking about. Did that character actually die during the sack of King's Landing? So I see these as all parts of the same mosaic, the same kind of jigsaw that we're trying to put all the pieces together on. So that's the just having a quick flick through. Antique Gamer, could the Knight of the Laughing Tree have a female horse that was on heat to beat the other three knights? In the Show of the Hands, Tourney of the Mountain was defeated by no. So this is a question as to whether or not the Knight of the Laughing Tree's horse could have been in heat, which allowed that knight to defeat the other three knights. I don't think so, because I don't think it's necessary. I think if you've seen my videos on this, I think that the Knight of the Laughing Tree was Lyanna. I think that she was known as an exceptional horsewoman. I think somebody, it may well have even been Roose Bolton, said she's half horse, that woman, meaning that she is so natural on on a horse. It's like she's a centaur. So she was an incredibly natural horsewoman. I don't think that she needed the extra added advantage of being able to of having a horse that might be distracting the other horses. I think that no, this is just her pure skill which won it. Let's have a quick flick through. I think I saw another super chat. Robert Lagville, proper insightful literary analysis meets sci-fi speculation. I'm sold. Keep it up. Thank you very much. That's very kind. Now, let's have a look. Just there are a few questioners asking after the tourney of Harrenhal. So I'm going to have a quick flick through just to see whether I can pick up a couple of these questions about Harrenhal. Tatiana Blue says, a lot of people assume that Tywin or Rhaegar must have sponsored the tourney at Harrenhal, but wouldn't the current house have had enough money to do so? So this is, well, I think the answer here is that the House Whent were the house in charge of Harrenhal at the time, and it was technically called by Lord Whent. Now, the reason why people think that this was perhaps not then is that, first of all, Harrenhal is hugely, as we've already said, hugely expensive just to run. They weren't known as a particularly wealthy house. Harrenhal was this huge burden on them. And then suddenly they managed to create a tourney where the prizes on offer were not just quite good, but 3 times the size of the previous largest tourney that happened in living memory, tourney, I think it was at Lannisport, that the prizes were huge. They were deliberately so, I think, in order to try and pull people in from all around the 7 kingdoms. So we don't think it was likely to be the House Whent. The question then is there any hint of anyone else who perhaps might have been behind this? And the story we're told is that Oswell Whent, who was the brother of Lord Whent and was a member of the Kingsguard, paid a visit to Lord Whent, immediately after which Lord Whent called the tourney. So the implication was that that Oswell went to see his brother, and he was coming with a message or an instruction from somebody else. Now, Oswell Whent was one of the inner circle of Rhaegar. He was one of those people who, a bit later, when Rhaegar goes off riding and ends up in the Riverlands collecting Lyanna, it's not just Arthur Dayne who goes with Rhaegar. Oswell Whent is also one of that group. So he is one of the key allies of Rhaegar. So the implication is that was what was going on. And there are lots of clues that Rhaegar was wanting the tourney to be an opportunity for him to be testing the ground or even holding a great council to see whether his father could be deposed. Now, if that's the case, that all adds up, because what you're wanting to do is a way of getting all of the noble lords of the land into one place, perhaps without most of them knowing or thinking that they're there for some huge plot or conspiracy. And the way to do that is at the end of a great winter to be doing a huge prize for a tourney, and everyone will go, right, great, that's it, we'll head on down to here. So that's why I and quite a few other people think it probably was Rhaegar who was behind this. Wonderby says, why was the tourney held at such a place? Was it during one of their let's try again times? It was held, the tourney was held at Harrenhal for the reasons that I gave, really. It was a convenient place because it was, well, it was convenient geographically, because it is in the center of Westeros. Everybody can get to it. It's right. It's not too far from the inn at the crossroads. The crossroads there, when we're talking about the inn of the crossroads, that is effectively the center point. It might not be the exact geographical center point, but in terms of the road and access network, that is the center point. You go south, you get to King's Landing. You go north, you get to Winterfell. You go west, you get to River Run. You go east, you get to the Eyrie. That's what the crossroads is there. And Harrenhal is right near there. So anyone who wants to be able to get there can get there nice and easily. And it also had, as well as having huge amounts of space, because it is a huge place, it also had a little bit of history, because one of the couple of different times when there was a great council in the past, that was held at Harrenhal. So the picking of it was practical reasons. There was sort of a thematic reason, and there was also the fact that Rhaegar could use Oswald Whent as a sort of a go-between for it. Scott McCloy saying, please tell the story of Jaime at Harrenhal. Very happy to do that. So Jaime was we'll reel back a little bit from Harrenhal, because this story starts a little bit earlier, because Aerys was starting to go, Aerys II, the Mad King, was starting to go more and more paranoid, and over time he had started to believe that Tywin was out to get him. And so they went through all these ups and downs with their kind of relationship. Tywin kind of stuck with him for a lot longer than most people probably would, given the kind of crazy stuff that Aerys was getting up to. But what finally broke that relationship was when Aerys said that he was going to make Jaime a member of the Kingsguard. And that was important because Jaime was Tywin's heir. And if Tywin wanted the name of the Lannisters to carry on, it would be through him, because he'd already discounted Tyrion, of course. Cersei was a woman and therefore would be married off to somebody else. So Jaime was where all of his hope was. And by taking Jaime into the Kingsguard, then Jaime was having to swear himself off of all previous loyalties, and also swear himself off of having children. So actually that was in one fell swoop that would manage to get rid of all that Tywin dreamed of. And Aerys decided that the place he wanted to do this was at Harrenhal, at this tourney at Harrenhal. So Jaime comes up there, and Aerys makes him a member of the Kingsguard. Now, there were huge cheers. Jaime was very dashing, perfect picture of a knight, obviously being made a member of the Kingsguard. Everyone was loving it. Huge cheers. Aerys thought these cheers were for him. But then when the Knight of the Laughing Tree, but then what he wanted to do was he then sent Jaime back down to King's Landing, didn't allow him to take part in the tourney, because although he now had got him as a member of the Kingsguard, it really was just a way to get at Tywin. So he sent him back to King's Landing. Jaime wasn't happy, complained a bit, but went off and did it anyway. Then when the Night of the Laughing Tree happened, Aerys actually initially thought that this was Jaime, who had snuck back in and had put on some ill-fitting armor and had done these things. So he was becoming paranoid that it was Jaime who was doing these things, even though Jaime had headed off back down south. So that's broadly the story of Jaime at Harrenhal. He headed down south really quite quickly. James Q&A, Robert, was Lyanna Stark the Laughing Knight? Yes, I believe so. I've answered that one already. I will scroll back down to the bottom just to see if we've got any more questions. I think maybe one or two. Guys, I think I'm going to go on for about 5 more minutes. So if you've got any more questions, then please do. Now's the time to drop them in there. Tywin, during the the tourney at Harrenhal, Tywin was indeed at Casterly Rock. Yes, there he was. He was boycotting it. Incidentally, as far as we can tell, we haven't got full confirmation of this, but as far as we can tell, Hoster Tully was as well. Hoster Tully was also angry with Aerys for the same reason, in fact, because they were Hoster Tully and Tywin Lannister were in the last stages of trying to agree a betrothal between Jaime Lannister and Lysa Arryn, which would have been politically advantageous for both of them, but Jaime being made a member of the Kingsguard meant that all collapsed. So Hoster Tully, we think, also was boycotting it. Almost everybody was there, but not everyone. Daisy K, I shall call you, having butchered your surname in the last live stream. Q&A, whose blood was used in the building of Harrenhal? Mass murder. This was the servants, this was the slaves, the thralls who were used to sort of run into the ground to build the structures. That was the blood that was there that we're talking about. Quickly flicking up through, trying to see any more questions. Bite This says, what was Tywin doing while the tourney of Harrenhal was going on? I don't think he was just twiddling his thumbs at Casterly Rock. That does seem to be what he was doing. I don't think he was twiddling his thumbs, but I do think that he was at Casterly Rock. I think that he was plotting, and I'll probably come onto this when I get onto that video about sort of part 3 of the rebellion, is that I think he was then starting to plot what's his next move, because you have to remember that for Tywin, he'd spent decades building himself up to this position where he was trying to get House Lannister as powerful as possible, and his two biggest, or the three biggest things that he could do was make sure that he was Hand of the King, so he was ruling the Seven Kingdoms effectively. He would get Jaime married and with children to ensure the continuation of House Lannister, and he would get Cersei married into the Targaryens, married to Rhaegar. That was his overall plan. And what had happened was that in a relatively short space of time, all of that had come collapsing down around his ears. Aerys had decided, no, Cersei's not going to marry Rhaegar, and so that was suddenly no longer happening. Jaime was not going to be marrying Lysa Tully, so that also was not happening. And Tywin himself, partly out of a fit of anger, I suspect, but also realizing that his position was getting increasingly dangerous in King's Landing. He was no longer Hand of the King. So actually the Lannisters were back, if not to square one, then all of his planning was for naught. So I think Tywin at that point was not the person to twiddle his thumbs. He would be the kind of person who would be planning what is the route back for House Lannister. So that, I think, was what he was doing. I think he was having a good old plan. Let's okay, guys, I'm going to have a look at the bottom here. B1 Merry, thank you very much for the super chat. Any guesses as to why so many people want Harrenhal? I think it's simply because it is the biggest and most impressive castle in the land. We view it as this kind of burnt down wreck, but I think that if you just view it through the eyes of somebody who wants to be powerful or just wants a huge castle, that is the ultimate. That is where you want to be. Yes, it might practically be horrible to maintain, but the reason why people are wanting it is because it is an astonishing piece of architecture. Its walls are so high. It's even with the top of the highest tower being melted, it is still higher than pretty much any other castle or structure, leaving aside perhaps the high tower and the area right up the top of the Giant's Lance. But one of the highest structures in the land. It is an amazing building. And in the same way that somebody nowadays could look at an incredibly dilapidated old house and go, you know what, I could build that, rebuild that, make that an astonishingly beautiful thing again. I think that lots of people are drawn to this idea that they might be able to turn it and make it back into what it was for just a few weeks. Frankly, that's because it was the wonder of the world at the time. Steph Snow says Q&A, why is Harrenhal so cursed and quick to change hands? It seems like the most circulating house ownership. Agreed. I've picked up on this a few times during this live stream. I think that the headline here, that some of it is just actually, frankly, being in the Riverlands and being in the center there is a lot more churn than there is at the extremes of land, by which I mean, if you look up at House Stark and a lot of the Northern Lords, they've been in place for a long time. Similarly, if you look down, Dawn or someone like that. But if there's any kind of wars or problems or rebellions, then they happen largely in the Riverlands and in the middle of the land. So there's always going to be a little bit more churn going on there. But yes, I think that there is some sort of magic. That I think that the land itself that Harrenhal is built on is not happy because the weirwood trees were chopped down. And so I think that there is, I think curse is probably the wrong word, but I think that there was magic unleashed through the building of it and through the fire igniting the sacrifice that was there already in the very stones of it. So I think that's what's going on. Guys, I think I'm going to bring this to a close now. We will be back next week. I think next week I'll make sure I have a guest on again. I love doing these just solo live streams every now and then. It gives me a chance to answer, I think, a whole lot more questions because there's a lot less to and fro between me and my guest. So I love doing these, but I will definitely be coming back to my guests. Incidentally, I asked my patrons 2 or 3 weeks ago who they wanted me to see, or who they wanted to see me do live streams with in the future. And patrons, I took note of all of that. Some fantastic suggestions there. I am talking to lots of the people that you suggested I get in contact with, and so you should see over the coming weeks and months a few of the faces that you've seen before. Incidentally, that's why we had Amanda back on the Disputed Lands, because there were lots of people said that they thought she was excellent, which she is indeed. That's why we had her back on, but there'll be a few new faces as well coming forward, people I've not collaborated with before that I think that you will really enjoy. So guys, thank you so much for this. Thank you again to my moderators. Thank you to my patrons and anyone who does a super chat. There's some fantastic comments going on there in the chat as well. So thank you so much for that. We'll be back same time next week. Take care, everyone, and I shall see you again soon.